You're standing on a city wall, crossbow aimed at approaching figures. Then you realize they're not enemy soldiers. They're your own people, forced forward as human shields by Mongol warriors behind them. This psychological nightmare was just one tactic Genghis Khan used against Jin Dynasty prisoners. But what he did to captured princes during victory feasts was so disturbing that even hardened warriors struggled to watch. And I'll reveal that at the end. What do you do when your enemy's greatest weakness becomes your most powerful weapon? The Jin Dynasty made a fatal miscalculation that would cost millions of lives. For decades, they had treated Mongol tribes as subhuman, raiding their camps, enslaving their people, and executing their leaders in the most humiliating ways possible. In 1160, the Jin Emperor ordered Ambaghai Khan, Genghis's great-uncle, to be nailed to a wooden donkey and left to die slowly in the sun. This wasn't just an execution, it was a message. The Jin wanted the Mongols to know their place, beneath Jin boots, forever. They treated Mongol prisoners like animals, working them to death in mines or selling them in markets alongside livestock. The Jin believed their civilization was superior, that their walls were impenetrable, and that these nomadic tribes would never pose a real threat. But the Jin Dynasty created something they couldn't control. Every Mongol child grew up hearing stories of relatives who disappeared into Jin slavery. Every tribe remembered the punitive raids where Jin soldiers burned their camps and took their women. When Genghis Khan finally unified the Mongol tribes in 1206, he didn't just create an army, he weaponized generations of rage. In 1210, the Jin Emperor sent an envoy demanding Genghis kneel and pay tribute, as Mongol Khans had done for decades. Genghis spat on the ground, turned his horse south, and declared one thing: the Jin Dynasty ends now. What the Jin didn't understand was that they weren't facing a barbarian raid. They were facing the accumulated fury of every Mongol who had been enslaved, tortured, or executed by Jin arrogance. The debt was about to be collected, and the interest was paid in blood. The Jin scrambled to fortify their borders, but they had already made their greatest mistake. They had taught the Mongols exactly what cruelty looked like. They had shown them that prisoners could be treated as less than human, that torture could be systematized, that entire populations could be processed like resources. The Mongols were excellent students. And when they began their invasion in 1211, they brought back every lesson the Jin had taught them, refined, perfected, and scaled to industrial proportions. But the revenge didn't start with killing. It started with something far more psychologically devastating, a tactic so cruel that Jin soldiers would freeze on their own walls, unable to defend their cities. Imagine watching your brother forced to build a siege tower designed to destroy your city. The Mongols didn't just take prisoners, they turned them into weapons against their own people. After every victory, Mongol commanders would separate Jin captives into two groups, those with useful skills and everyone else. Engineers, carpenters, and craftsmen were kept alive and put to work immediately, building siege equipment under guard. But here's where it gets truly sadistic. These weren't just laborers. When the siege towers, battering rams, and scaling ladders were finished, the Mongols would force the same prisoners who built them to push them toward the walls during assaults. Jin defenders on the battlements would see faces they recognized. Neighbors from their district, former soldiers from their garrison, sometimes their own family members, being driven forward by Mongol cavalry with whips and spears. The psychological warfare was calculated with mathematical precision. Mongol generals understood that Jin culture placed enormous value on family loyalty and community bonds. So they deliberately positioned prisoners where their faces would be visible from the walls, close enough that defenders could see their expressions, hear their screams. Some prisoners tried to warn their former comrades, shouting about Mongol tactics or weaknesses. The Mongols didn't stop them because they knew what would happen next. Jin commanders faced an impossible choice: order their archers to shoot their own people, killing the human shields to stop the Mongol advance, or hold fire and let the enemy reach the walls. Most held their fire. Morale collapsed faster than walls ever could. Soldiers who moments before were ready to die defending their city would suddenly hesitate, argue with officers, or outright refuse orders. The Mongols broke Jin resistance without losing a single warrior. But the human shield tactic had another layer of cruelty that most people don't know about. The Mongols would dress some prisoners in captured Mongol armor and give them weapons, not to fight, but to absorb arrows. Jin defenders would waste their ammunition shooting what they thought were Mongol soldiers, only to realize too late they'd been killing their own people. By the time the real Mongol assault began, the defenders were low on arrows, psychologically shattered, and often in open mutiny against their own commanders. It was warfare designed to make the enemy destroy themselves from within. And this was just the opening move. The siege of Zhongdu in 1214 revealed just how patient Mongol cruelty could be. The Jin Dynasty's capital, modern-day Beijing, held over 1 million people behind walls so massive that Mongol siege engines couldn't breach them. So Genghis Khan did something unexpected. He didn't attack. He built a wooden wall around the entire city, 54 miles of fortifications designed not to keep people out, but to trap them in. Then he waited. Inside Zhongdu, the Jin emperor had stockpiled enough food for 6 months, maybe a year if rationed carefully. He thought he could outlast the Mongols, that these nomadic warriors would get bored and leave. He was wrong. The Mongols had all the time in the world, and they knew that hunger and disease were more efficient killers than arrows. Within 4 months, the situation inside Zhongdu descended into hell. The food ran out first, then people started eating leather, bark, and rats. When those were gone, they turned on each other. Chinese historical records describe the streets becoming slippery with human fat as starving people butchered the dead and then the living. Plague broke out in the packed, unsanitary conditions, killing thousands daily. Bodies piled up faster than they could be disposed of, rotting in the summer heat and spreading disease even faster. The Mongols outside the walls could smell the death from miles away. They still didn't attack. They just maintained the blockade and watched as one of the world's greatest cities consumed itself from the inside. Jin officials who tried to negotiate were told the same thing. Surrender completely or everyone dies. No middle ground, no mercy, just a simple choice between total submission and total annihilation. When Jungdu finally fell in 1215, the Mongols didn't rush in to massacre survivors. They did something colder. They opened the gates and let people flee, then tracked where they went and destroyed those cities next. The survivors weren't lucky, they were marked. They spread stories of what they'd endured, infecting every other Jin city with terror. Mongol commanders understood that 100 terrified refugees were more valuable than 100 dead bodies. Fear spreads. Fear breaks resistance before battle even begins. And the Jin Dynasty's population reflected this strategy. Northern China lost 2/3 of its people during the Mongol invasion. That's not just death in battle, that's systematic depopulation through starvation, disease, and terror. But for the prisoners who survived sieges and were captured alive, there was a bureaucratic nightmare waiting for them that made starvation look quick. The Mongols ran prisoner processing like a military supply chain. After capturing a city, soldiers would divide inhabitants into categories with terrifying efficiency. Every Mongol warrior was given a quota, a specific number of people they had to account for, either as slaves or corpses. There was no maybe category, no prisoners of war waiting for exchange. You were inventory. Artisans, engineers, and scribes went into one group, valuable enough to keep alive. Women of childbearing age went into another. Future slaves for Mongol households. Everyone else, especially military-age men who might rebel, went to the execution grounds. This wasn't rage or bloodlust, it was logistics. The Mongols processed human beings with the same cold calculation they used for distributing horses and weapons. In 1212, during peace negotiations, the Jin Dynasty sent over 100,000 prisoners to the Mongol camp as a gesture of goodwill, hoping to buy time. Genghis Khan accepted them, thanked the Jin diplomats, and sent them home. Then he had every single prisoner executed overnight. The killing took hours, not because it was complicated, but because of the sheer numbers. Mongol soldiers worked in shifts, methodically going through the captives. The Jin diplomats returned to their emperor thinking they'd secured peace. When they learned what happened, the message was clear. Genghis Khan wasn't interested in gestures. He wanted the Jin dynasty erased, and anyone associated with it, even as a prisoner, was already dead. The execution quota system ensured that Mongol soldiers couldn't show mercy even if they wanted to. Their commanders checked the numbers, and if you came back with living prisoners when you were supposed to have corpses, you'd answer for it. But the quota system had another purpose that most historians miss. It prevented Mongol soldiers from developing sympathy for conquered populations. By forcing every warrior to participate in systematic killing, the Mongols eliminated the possibility of individual soldiers questioning orders or showing compassion. You couldn't be the good Mongol who spared people, because your unit had a body count to meet, and if you didn't kill your share, your comrades would have to do extra work. It was collective responsibility for collective atrocities, ensuring that everyone was complicit and no one could claim innocence. This is how empires industrialize cruelty, by making it mandatory, routine, and measured. And for Jin nobility captured alive, the Mongols had something even more psychologically devastating than a quick execution. The Mongols believed that blood spilled on the ground angered the earth spirits and caused natural disasters. They also believed that if a person of noble blood died without their blood touching the earth, their soul couldn't reach the afterlife or become an ancestor. This wasn't superstition to them, it was cosmic law. So when they captured Jin princes, generals, or high officials, they developed execution methods specifically designed to kill without spilling blood. This wasn't about being humane. It was about spiritual annihilation. They wanted Jin nobility to know they wouldn't just die, they'd be erased from existence itself, unable to join their ancestors or be honored by their descendants. The terror wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical, and the methods they used were as creative as they were horrifying. The most common bloodless execution was being wrapped in carpets or felt and trampled by horses. Mongol cavalry would ride over the rolled carpet repeatedly until every bone was pulverized, organs ruptured, and the victim suffocated from internal bleeding. But all the blood stayed inside the body, satisfying Mongol spiritual requirements while still delivering an agonizing death. Another method was being crushed under wooden platforms. Mongol commanders would place Jin princes beneath heavy boards, then hold victory feasts on top of them. As the celebration went on, the weight of dozens of people eating, drinking, and dancing would slowly press down, crushing the victims underneath while Mongols literally celebrated above them. The screaming would eventually stop, but the feast would continue. This is what I promised to reveal at the beginning, and yes, this actually happened. Chinese historical records confirm it, and even some Mongol warriors found it disturbing, not because of the cruelty, but because the screaming disrupted the celebration. A third method was forcing stones down prisoners' throats until they choked or their stomachs ruptured. Mongol soldiers would pry open the victim's mouth, shove rocks inside, and hold their jaw shut until they swallowed or suffocated. Sometimes they'd pour molten silver or gold down throats instead, a symbolic gesture showing that the wealth Jin officials hoarded couldn't save them. These weren't random acts of sadism. They were calculated, spiritually motivated executions designed to maximize psychological impact on survivors. When word spread that Jin nobility weren't just being killed, but were being prevented from reaching the afterlife, it destroyed morale in ways that simple beheading never could. You weren't just fighting to save your life, you were fighting to save your eternal soul. And the Mongols made sure everyone knew, resist and you'll be erased from history in heaven. The aftermath of Mongol victories looked like something from an apocalypse. After capturing the city of Nishapur, Mongol soldiers stacked enemy bodies like rotten logs for 30 miles along the road. They weren't trying to dispose of corpses, they were building monuments to terror. Towers made entirely of skulls became Mongol signatures across Asia. After taking Herat, they beheaded 24,000 people and arranged the heads on stakes throughout the city in neat rows, organized by age and gender. Travelers approaching Herat from miles away would see forests of stakes topped with rotting heads, swaying in the wind. This wasn't mindless violence. This was calculated propaganda designed to break the will of the next city on the Mongol route. But the most disturbing detail is what they did with bodies after execution. Mongol forces would throw thousands of corpses into rivers upstream from cities they were about to besiege. The decomposing bodies would poison the water supply, spreading disease before the Mongols even arrived. Defenders would start dying from dysentery and cholera before facing a single arrow, weakening garrisons without the Mongols losing a man. In some cases, Mongol engineers would dam rivers, let corpses accumulate behind the dam, then release the water all at once, sending a wave of death and disease flooding into enemy cities. Western sources called these tactics barbaric, but Mongol generals saw them as efficient. Why waste soldiers storming walls when you can let contaminated water do the work? And the psychological impact was devastating. Jin defenders knew the Mongols were using their own dead neighbors as biological weapons. The terror campaign worked so well that entire cities surrendered without resistance once they heard the Mongols were coming. The stories spread faster than the Mongol army itself. Tales of human shields, starvation sieges, bloodless executions, and rivers filled with bodies. By 1215, Jin commanders were facing mutinies from their own troops who refused to defend cities against the Mongols. Better to surrender and hope for slavery than to resist and guarantee annihilation. The Mongols understood something that most conquerors didn't. Leaving survivors to tell horror stories was more strategically valuable than killing everyone. A completely destroyed city sends no message. But a city where refugees escape to spread tales of what they witnessed? That breaks the next 10 cities before you even arrive. Terror became the Mongols' most effective weapon, and Jin prisoners were the medium through which that message was delivered. After the Jin Dynasty finally collapsed in 1234, Mongol general Subutai proposed something that sounds impossible until you realize they seriously considered it. He suggested massacring the entire remaining population of northern China, every person, every village, every city, and converting the farmland into open grassland for Mongol horses. This wasn't a rage-fueled threat. It was a calculated military proposal presented to Ögedei Khan with logistics and timelines. Subutai argued that agricultural societies were fundamentally incompatible with Mongol nomadic culture. Chinese farmers would always resist, always rebel, always be a problem. But if you eliminated them entirely and turned their farms into pasture, you'd solve the problem permanently. The proposal included estimates, how many soldiers it would take, how long the massacres would require, even what to do with the cities afterward. Burn them, leave nothing but grass. What stopped this genocide wasn't morality, it was economics. Ögedei Khan's Chinese advisor Yelü Chucai made a counter-proposal. Living Chinese peasants who pay taxes are more valuable than empty grassland. He calculated that the Mongols could collect massive amounts of silver annually from Chinese taxpayers, far more wealth than horses would generate. Ögedei ran the numbers and agreed. The Chinese population was spared not because the Mongols suddenly developed compassion, but because slavery and taxation were more profitable than extermination. Think about how close northern China came to complete depopulation. If Yelü Chucai had been less persuasive, if Ögedei had valued horses over silver, the history of China would have ended in the 1230s. Tens of millions of people owed their survival to an economic argument, not moral reasoning. That's the cold reality of Mongol decision-making. Everything was calculated based on strategic value. But even with that decision, the damage was catastrophic beyond comprehension. The Jin Dynasty had recorded 7.6 million households in the early 13th century, potentially representing 60 million people. After the Mongol conquest, the census counted only 1.7 million households, maybe 10 million people. That's an 83% population loss in 2 decades. These aren't just battle deaths. This is starvation, disease, massacre, and depopulation on a scale that reshaped the landscape itself. Abandoned farms returned to forest. Cities built over centuries became empty ruins. Roads disappeared under vegetation. The environmental impact was so severe that scientists studying ice core samples have found that global carbon dioxide levels dropped during this period because so much farmland was abandoned that forests reclaimed huge areas of China. The Mongols killed so many people that it changed Earth's atmosphere. Conservative estimates put the death toll from Genghis Khan's campaigns against the Jin between 2 and 15 million people. But even that massive range doesn't capture the full horror. These numbers represent individuals. Farmers who were killed in their fields, children who starved during sieges, merchants who were executed for having the wrong ethnicity, soldiers who were turned into human shields and shot by their own comrades. Each number is someone who watched their world end. And the truly disturbing part? This level of destruction was deliberate policy, not accidental collateral damage. The Mongols understood exactly what they were doing. They calculated the terror, measured the population reduction, and concluded that this approach worked. Other empires would spend years consolidating control over conquered territories. The Mongols just eliminated the population until control was no longer necessary. The Jin Dynasty thought they were dealing with illiterate nomads who would eventually get tired and go home. They believed their superior culture, advanced technology, and fortified cities made them untouchable. Their arrogance cost them everything. The Mongols weren't uncivilized, they were differently civilized, with a value system that prioritized efficiency and terror over the bureaucratic cruelty the Jin had practiced. When you compare what the Jin did to Mongol prisoners before the war, enslaving them, torturing them, executing their leaders on wooden donkeys, to what the Mongols did after, you realize this wasn't unprovoked savagery. This was revenge systematized into military doctrine. The Jin created their destroyers by teaching the Mongols exactly how brutal an empire could be. They just never imagined those lessons would come back perfected and scaled to industrial proportions. What happened to Jin prisoners wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a calculated strategy of terror designed to break the will to resist across entire civilizations. The human shields, the starvation sieges, the bloodless executions, the skull towers, every tactic served a purpose. And it worked. By the time the Mongol Empire finished expanding, they'd conquered more territory than any empire in human history, largely because their reputation preceded them. Cities surrendered at the first sight of Mongol scouts. Kingdoms paid tribute before armies even arrived. The suffering of Jin prisoners became a weapon that conquered half the known world. If this exposed a side of history that school never taught you, subscribe to this channel, because we're going to keep uncovering the stories that textbooks ignore. Hit that like button if you want more deep dives into the darkest chapters of the past, and drop a comment telling me what historical horror you want investigated next. The algorithm only shows this content to people if you engage, so your like and comment literally determines whether these hidden stories reach more people. I'll see you in the next investigation into what really happened when empires stopped pretending to be civilized.